So yeah, hi again, everyone, and thanks for coming. Today, Christoph and Kiia from our group are going to present an ongoing work, or an upcoming work about dodging the autocratic bullet, how democratic near misses can inform behavioral science. And I can't talk. But, Anyway, yeah, so thanks, Christoph and Kiia. Who's going to start?
Christoph.
Yes, I'm going to start. Thank you very much all for coming. Kiia and I will switch a bit today, introducing different parts, but let me give you a brief overview. So we start with some definitions, then move on into the misses section, explaining what they're all about, what we can learn from them. Then we introduce a model, which we think suits quite nicely from considering the learnings we can take from the near misses. Then we move into factors undermining democratic stability and have a conclusion at the end. So definitions. Of course, democracy, although every one of us is frequently talking about democracy, is actually not that easy to define. It's very broad as a concept. It has very different angles, but what I think what boils it down quite nicely is an Abraham Lincoln quote saying that democracy is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And like from measurement perspective, there are various concepts to approach it. Freedom House, for example, is a great think tank that works on it. Polity, V-Dem, but most of them are expert assessments. So actually trying to pin down what democracy is on an objective kind of level, where objective means, is rather difficult and is rarely done. The opposite of democracy is autocracy, or autocracy should be considered to be an opposite, because same case here, autocracy is very broad of a concept. There's no agreed upon definition, but what is more or less clear to everyone is that it's characterized by defective elections, so an infringement on electoral rights, constraints to freedom of speech, assembly, and association, so civil rights are infringed as well, and it violates horizontal accountability and various like protection of minority rights. Yes, then to give you an overview of what we think democracy should look like, we take the approach from the varieties of democracy, concept of democracy, which differentiates 5 components: electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberative, and egalitarian. Electoral, very straightforward, whether rulers are actually responsive to elections, so they face some kind of competition at the ballot box. And V-Dem states there is no real democracy without having elections, but again, it's not enough for a proper democracy. Then we have the liberal component, which entails the protection of individual minority rights, especially in respect to the tyranny of the majority. Then we direct rule and active participation of citizens beyond mere voting. So everything basically that is done by civil society organizations, parties, and so on. So everything that's not ballot related. Then a deliberative component that concerns the respectful and reasonable dialogue at all levels of political discussion. So both at the elite level between politicians, but then also at the citizen level. And egalitarian refers to the equal distribution of resources in every shape or form, which then also translates into an equal access to politics and political participation and, in a sense, political equality. Okay, then up to Kiia.
Yes. So when we talk about near misses of democracy, how we define a near miss is that we rely on the definition from Haken Ginsberg. So it happens when a country first experiences deterioration in the quality of a well-functioning democratic institution without fully sliding into authoritarianism, and then number 2, within a time frame of a few years, at least partially recovers its high-quality democracy. As for democratic backsliding or autocratization, that occurs when there's a decline in democratic characteristics of the society. So, for instance, in the freedom of elections. Now, in terms of cases, Christoph, if you can change the slide. The cases we are looking at, we selected these based on existing literature. These had been examined by others. So we have Finland from the 1930s, UK and the British Union of Fascists from the 1930s, Colombia in 2010, Sri Lanka in 2015, and South Korea in 2017. In all of these cases, the erosion often began with political elites pushing boundaries of their power. So they were little by little trying to see how much they can change the law. For instance, in Colombia, the president Álvaro Uribe, he made a constitutional change and changed the constitution so that rather than being able to be in power for just one term, he was able to rule for 2 electoral terms. But upon attempting to change the constitution again for a 3rd term, the judiciary said no more. So indeed, it was the strong judiciary that then stopped the democratic backsliding in Colombia. In all of these cases, we can see that it is not the individual or the systematic factors that would be more important than the others. So with Finland as well, the strong judiciary ensured that Finland remained a young democracy. But then actually with South Korea, it was a popular protest that gave judiciary the impetus to act and impeach the president. Of course, in this day and age, we cannot forget the US and the UK and the ongoing situation, but because it is ongoing, we will not be discussing it. We don't know how it will end. That's a story for maybe 5 to 10 years from now when we know more. Christoph, if you can change the slide. So although the ways in which democracies get challenged in countries, it varies, we can find some shared facets that undermine democratic governance. So there is vertical, horizontal, and diagonal accountability, which all protect democratic societies, but any one of these can fail. So with vertical, it's electoral processes and political parties, which can be used to address the issue of people in office abusing their powers. Horizontal, on the other hand, refers to other state actors with the authority to demand explanations and impose sanctions, and they are responsible for overseeing the executive agencies. And lastly, but for certain not least, we've got the diagonal, which is the media and the civil society. They are able to disseminate information to political actors, as well as mobilize against autocratizing incumbents. So for instance, again, in the case of South Korea, the media was able to mobilize the public, and the public went onto the streets to protest, which then allowed the judiciary to see that, yes, okay, we need to do something about this. Now, next, Christoph will talk about our model.
Yes, thank you. So given the process Kiia just described, there are very incremental steps at some point until like the system cannot bear it anymore. We thought about, okay, how can psychology, cognitive science, like provide theories that more or less reflect that process. And one theory that works is the, or could work, is the drift to danger model by Rasmussen, from originally developed for socio-technical system to describe how accidents happen. So for example, on an aircraft carrier, nuclear power plant, stuff like that. And he describes the drift to danger as systematic migration of organizational behavior toward accident under the influence of pressure towards cost effectiveness in an aggressive competing environment. And the issue here is that various forces exist that drive behavior into a certain direction, or drive the system away from like a point of stability. So for example, in the Rasmussen examples, you have cost effectiveness that needs to be adhered to, and that means people have to either work harder or move away from certain work practices that are considered safe into an area where like accidents are more prone to happen, or the workload becomes unacceptable. And these deviations from acceptable practices occur over time. So there's a certain deviation or movement away from a pre-specified norm, and a new norm settles at some point, which then is again moved away at some point in time. And these various pressures eventually lead or create a situation in which the whole system is threatened by these violations of system borders, and eventually those issues manifest in accidents. However, there is no inherent pathology, so to say, by these deviations from norms, but it is more or less adaptive behavior. So circumstances change, and these new changes, which frequently are undetected, then established a new, less safe norm, but it's more or less a behavior that emerges in a lot of systems. But there is a margin of error. So even if there is certain, for example, unsafe practices are adopted, that doesn't necessarily mean that the system immediately collapses, but there's more like a margin of error. So simple violations or one-time violations do not crash the entire system, but like they weaken it. So adopting this to a democratic system, at least like that's the work in progress. So we are open for feedback and discussion. But if you consider the 4 V-Dem components that are non-electoral, because like we have to take elections as a given, you could also use the same model Rasmussen applied and try to map the democratic process on it. So you again have a kind of margin of error. You have different system boundaries in respect to all 4 V-Dem components. So for example, liberal, deliberative, participatory, and for example, if a system or in the liberal component or a part of the liberal component is violated, it could, for example, lead to a tyranny of majority. And if there's a tyranny of majority, the whole democratic system is less stable than it would be if their minority rights are protected. More specifically, as in the Rasmussen model, there's some variables, some drivers that make democratic system unstable or that lead to a certain degree of instability. For example, populism, misinformation. If you have a strong tendency of populism, for example, it could erode support for protection of minority rights. It could also delegitimize elections. It could lead to higher political inequality. So all these factors build up slowly over time and erode the entire system. But it does not necessarily collapse immediately. That is exactly what we have seen in the near misses cases. Things happen over time. The entire system gets destabilized, but it doesn't entirely crash. The more of these, let's say, protective factors remain, the better the system is able to absorb certain violations. But the more violations, the less room for absorbing them. And again, it happens largely over time, and in the democratic space, in most cases, it is a violation of norms. So, for example, like in the US, as an example, the peaceful transfer of power. But of course, given the norm the system, it's very fuzzy to define, it's very difficult to pin down. So how is a civil political discourse defined? What is enough political participation? At what point should we see drop-in participation be a problematic factor, and so on? So figuring out the details is somewhat of an issue here. And we started to map or to identify certain factors that are problematic for the democratic stability. One of them is, for example, the disenchantment of voters. So voters do not participating in elections anymore. Populism, susceptibility to misinformation, conspiracy theories. So various factors there, but of course the list isn't exhaustive. So we still are up for or happy to receive feedback on that. And we will subsequently focus only on the liberal, participatory, and deliberative part, because we think the electoral and the egalitarian are a bit of a difficult to address issue for behavioral science.
Indeed. So there is a distinction between the system and the individual level. So as Christoph said, some of the variables, we cannot really address them, especially those on the systematic level. So for instance, the socioeconomic inequality, ease of voting, corruption, or civil society organizations, so the rogue civil society, or even antisocial capital to an extent. But then there are others that can occur at both levels. Christoph, if you can reveal the next part of the slides, thank you. Such as populism, information ecosystem, etc. And there are many that really cannot be confined to a single V-Dem component, but impact several ones, for instance, the liberal and deliberative parts. So now if we next look at the liberal part, we have populism and misinformation. Again, definitions are important. So we are looking at populism as a two-factor concept, which at its core is people-centric and anti-elitist. And it can obviously be used to advance pro-social causes, but this is rarely done. More often, populism is used to do things that are not so great for democracy. And it is linked for preference for direct over representative democracy, which of course, when in Western societies, representative democracy is the most common type of democracy. This is a problem. And populists tend to simplify citizens into one common group where there is no space for differences of opinions or views. So it can then undermine the support for horizontal accountability, for instance, as a person might think that only my candidate truly knows how the problems will be solved and what the real problems are. Misinformation, on the other hand, it threatens the epistemic potential of democratic decision-making because people don't have the full picture, they don't have the real information in front of them, and it impairs their ability to make decisions. And it indeed can threaten support for instance, minority rights, which have been identified as an important aspect in protecting democracies, especially in younger democracies, so for instance, in countries such as Latvia. Now, with participatory, we've got conspiracy theories, which, just to recap, are nicely defined as an attempt to explain events or social conditions by proposing a secret plot between powerful people or organizations that aims to accomplish sinister ends through continuing deception of the public. And conspiracy theories are then associated with conspiracist beliefs that are linked to political cynicism, decreased trust in authorities, and decreased political participation, which again threaten democracy. And as was seen with populism, with those who believe in conspiracy theories, there is support for non-normative participation and increased support for stealth and direct democracy. So democracy where decisions are made by people who are not elected by the public, or an electorate decides on policy initiatives without elected representatives. Now, the second part of our participatory components consists of rogue civil society and antisocial capital. In principle, civil society participation is linked to positive feelings towards democracy and political engagement. However, civil society organizations are rarely independent from the state, if not because of funding, then because of how a state defines what can be registered as a civil society organization. And anti-democratic civil society organizations are negatively correlated with post-independence levels of democracy. So even if, in principle, civil society organizations do good, there is a potential for a state to say that what you are doing is not okay, you cannot be a civil society organization, and they will only allow those who, for instance, advance their policies to move forward. And semi-related to it is antisocial capital, an adverse version of Putnam's social capital, which creates cohesive and highly polarized groups that organize around anti-democratic behaviors, such as spreading conspiracy theories and questioning legitimacy of institutions, etc. And for instance, militia groups would fall into this category as well. Now, in terms of the deliberative part, we've got toxic polarization, which is the polarization of society and politics. In a societal level, it's differences in opinion, which lead to major clashes of views and a polarization of public attitudes. And with political polarization, it's the extent to which society is split into antagonistic camps, and that goes beyond political discussions and affects social relationships. And bearing in mind that it has been found that effective political polarization is equal or greater than the levels of racial polarization, this is quite concerning. Whereas with the information ecosystem, There's the use of digital media, which is associated with higher rates of hate, populism, polarization, and again, exposure to misinformation, as well as the opaque personalization in the information ecosystem, which biases the impression of degree of consensus and issue relevance. Now, what can behavioral science do, Christoph?
Yes, so looking at if you look at all the near misses cases, something becomes very clear. Elite norm violation and executive power grab is among the most important factors. So once the backsliding is triggered, in most cases that is done by single kind of elites or individual elites, but also the way back is in many cases initiated by certain elites. So trying to strengthen the understanding of elite behavior and its impact on democratic stability and increase the salience of norms could be two aspects that behavioral science can help to avoid this very top-down threat to democracy. Then there's also an idea of a broken pyramid of scrutiny, which basically states that very low-level individuals or low-level bureaucrats are much more tightly monitored and scrutinized than those at the very top. And the argument by Green basically is, well, just flip it. If you have, the more power you have, the more you should be scrutinized. And of course, that makes a lot of sense. And like trying to increase the awareness or the issue salience for it could be something that behavioral science can do. However, the whole idea of addressing elites, of course, from a behavioral science perspective is a bit difficult. You have various approaches, but probably the easiest would be to just have better laws that address the issue more holistically. But then again, why, if those people who do the norms are not interested in having them, well, you need to create some kind of movement within society. And of course, the next thing that is pretty clear to us is the information system, and it makes sense there to combine environmental and competence-based interventions. So a combination of nudging and boosting that addresses the structures and the people itself. And then also to both direct attention to increase individual autonomy. But then again, you can also come up with different ideas to boost competence. So for example, lateral reading, critical ignoring, all these individual level based interventions that help people to redirect attention and understand what they're exposed to when moving in this novel information ecosystem. But again, that is, of course, only a snapshot of all the factors that threaten democratic stability, and we are happy to receive feedback and ideas on what other interventions could be suitable here. So as a conclusion and kind of a summary, near misses are often led by elites, but they also have the power to stop them. So addressing elites is crucial to strengthen the democracy, but of course also a rather difficult part. And looking at this, it seems like a migrational model like the drift to danger from Rasmussen seems very applicable to us. And because, like, as an implication, functional democracies can absorb violations, but are increasingly less able to do so the more violations occur. So that also has implications on the timing of intervention. So of course, the earlier we spot intervention, or less the spot situations in which we should intervene, the better it is. So ideas related to some kind of early warning, early detection system could also come into play here. And especially since these violations occur often unnoticed. And that is also something that is very prevalent in all the near misses, and then also in like the general democratic backsliding literature, that frequently scholars state, well, people are unaware of what happened until it was too late. And like trying to avoid this being too late could also be something that behavioral science can help about. But of course, primarily, behavioral science can address risk factors on the individual level, and through the individual level, ultimately enhance democratic stability. But the issue here is we have system level factors, we have individual level factors, and both of them are intertwined. So a unidimensional approach might not be ideal to actually solve those issues. So I think the most prominent one is socioeconomic inequality. It's very difficult for behavioral science to do something, if it is at all possible, because that should be either done by political scientists or economists, or like the system level framework. Yes, then that's it for the moment. Thank you very much. And we're looking very much forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I see Don has a question.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating. So I had a few questions. The first one was about the model that you had, the sort of sliding to, oh, I forgot what it's called already, but the one where you're applying it, the drift to danger. And I think what I found interesting was you assumed elections were a given, but then what about things like systematic disenfranchisement of people? Or would you consider that's a sub-boundary of the rest of the 4 pieces?
We have actually discussed about disenfranchisement, and this is certainly something that happens. However, many of these cases were sort of quite Europe-focused, Western-focused, and because of the European Convention of Human Rights essentially enshrining the right to free elections within the member states, and looking at the literature, much of it was focused on the US, but this is because there is systematic disenfranchisement of felons over there, and there have been some cases of disenfranchisement in the UK as well. So this is certainly something that needs to be bear in mind, but when it comes to this model, we have to sort of try to become more specific, because otherwise it gets very difficult to cope with everything that's out there. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, unfortunately. Christoph, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's very good, and very, like, you're putting like the finger to where it hurts. Yeah, it's we try to conceptualize a bit similar to what V-Dem did. So they basically say, well, electoral is important, and if the electoral component isn't there, it's actually not a democracy. So we thought, okay, well, then we also just take it as a given. But then again, there are many cases, especially in the US, where like it gets difficult to vote through like gerrymandering approaches, or to these like voter ID laws, everything related to that. That is something we could address. But we were wondering whether that is actually something behavioral science can help, or is it more like a law kind of political system issue? And so we probably thought, okay, well, we deal just with it in a footnote.
Yeah, I mean, like I personally think it's an important component of the model whether or not behavioral science can fix it. But I think like there are studies that show that if you, for example, if you have voter ID, then more people will be disenfranchised.
Yes.
And so that's probably something to point out, as in like at least you can find evidence on that sort of thing and incorporate it.
Yeah.
I had the second question was about behavioral science, and so I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was wondering what about research looking into how you might change the behaviors of elites, or those who perceive themselves as elites? Like, are there interventions that might change how they consider others in the society, or how they behave in general? Would that be a pressure point worth trying to push?
Yes, absolutely. We're still in the process of doing that. We like just came up this week with the idea of like trying to tackle, or like to pin down this norm violation by elites as an interventional angle.
Yeah, can I just remembered a study, an amazing study that was done by Reifler and Nyhan some time ago with state legislators in the United States, where they actually ran an experiment on the legislators who didn't know that they were in a study. And the way it worked was that half of them received a letter that basically threatened them with reputational damage if they were lying. And the other half, at random, got a letter just saying nothing. And then it turned out that the state legislators who received the letter with the reputational threat were caught out less often by fact checkers than the others. So this was a real life experiment done with state elections in the United States. And the intervention was targeted at certain people, but not others. And they found a difference in accuracy, basically, between the two groups of politicians. So that's one study I can think of where behavioral science actually intervened with elite behavior, which I think is a great place to start. I had forgotten about that study until a minute ago. So I think that's very good. The other thing, if I can make a few comments, I mean, first of all, fantastic, very, very informative, very lots of good material there and references I would like to look at and read because I don't know the papers.
They are there on the last slide.
Okay, fine. Now, but a couple of questions, I guess, or considerations. First of all, how does behavioral science and everything else you say at the end relate to the near misses, the case studies, Finland, the UK in the 1930s? I thought the case studies are very interesting. I've read the draft of the paper and they're in far greater depth than the paper and it makes fascinating reading. But it isn't clear to me how what you then conclude about the drift danger and behavioral science and all that, how that would have helped or how we can apply that to the next crisis. Okay, that was one thing I was missing. Well, maybe you want to respond to that. I have a few other things, but maybe you want to respond to that.
Sure. So our idea was to have some kind of a process model in mind that, or like a migrational model that is not as, that basically unifies all these different case studies into one coherent model that also then also describes or like helps as an analytical framework.
Okay.
Like the more I think about it, I think the less it is necessary at some point. It is, at least like for me, helpful to guide my understanding of what happens, but maybe it also adds too much complexity to it. And it's just easier to singularity state, okay, like this happened here, this happened there, and then we just like cut it down and summarize it.
Let me briefly just say, actually, okay, I totally get that. I think it's a good idea. But then what I think I would need to see is Finland in the 1930s in that space of the drift danger model, and you map out some sort of trajectory towards some boundary that it almost crashed, but it didn't quite. Yeah. So that would then make the model more integrative if you could embed the case studies or interpret them within the model.
Yeah, just to add on that, like my point was that models are made basically a tool to draw predictions, right? And what I was missing from, I thought it was really interesting theoretical work to try and rearrange those different components into the model, but I was missing what are the concrete predictions that we can draw from the model and how we could put this model to test basically for the next. Well, you were talking about the US and the UK and Israel and maybe other democracies at risk, and what exactly are the processes at play that you can actually put this model to test in, right?
Well, my response to that would be that elite norm violation seems to be a key factor here.
Yeah.
And that is something that we can identify in the UK, Israel, the US, God knows where else. I haven't. Oh, Brazil, right? I think that is a total, common denominator, and maybe we should, at the end, say, well, we're in a really bad trajectory here because of these norm violations by elites.
And also, I know that the course of the paper is basically those near misses, right? But like, you don't want to train a model on just misses. You also want to see the hits, right? Where actually, what are the case studies of countries or democracies that didn't survive, that went full backsliding in this particular model? Maybe
that would probably be another paper then.
Well, yeah, in a sense, but when you're pinpointing to norm violation by elites, you can also, well, I don't know if this is hand wavy or not, but say, well, this is where this happens, where there was a big norm violation, a major norm violation in those countries, and which are not democracies anymore. I don't know, say, I don't know if Turkey is the case, or other.
Turkey would be close. Well, I can also think of the 1970s, these military dictatorships in South America.
Right. Yeah.
Chile is a good example that went completely, flipped over, and that would be interesting to see if elite norm violations were also in play there. I suspect, from my recollection of these cases from a distance, that what happened there was military involvement, in addition to whatever elite norm violation may have occurred.
So,
it's possible that you need the added military factor to really drive it over the border. I don't know. Can I make another point about you made a distinction between systemic level variables and behavioral individual level factors. And I know we talked about this, and of course, as a first approximation, I think that's a good idea. And if you then focus on the individual level, it justifies why psychologists would be interested in this, or should be interested in this, or should contribute something, as opposed to political scientists, right? Because to some extent, we have to justify why we as psychologists are doing this work rather than our colleagues in political science. So I do understand the motivation. However, again, two things. Number one, I didn't see the individual level stuff linked to the near misses. It might be worth doing that in the final paper. I mean, maybe there was a dude in Finland who saved the day, and I think, there were identifiable people in some of these cases. So yes. It might be worth actually identifying those and naming them.
Yeah, in Sri Lanka as well, there was clearly, because what happened was that the president was opposed by someone, and the opposition, they all rallied behind this one person. So yeah, that's certainly something we can look into.
Okay, but then the second issue with that is that I think to some extent you're underestimating what psychology can contribute to some of these systemic variables. And Dawn already hinted at that in terms of analysis of what we can do with these systemic factors. And I'm thinking of inequality, and Gordon is the world's expert on that, and the effect that inequality has on individual psychology. So I'm now thinking that maybe we shouldn't run away from some of these systemic issues, because behavioral science does have stuff to say about that. And I would actually like to hear from Gordon, if you don't mind, what you make of this last point, especially your work on inequality and how that relates.
Yeah, happy to. I also want to say first that I think this is absolutely fascinating stuff, close to lots of what we're interested in ourselves up here, though we're going in a slightly different way, in that it's our sort of emphasis is more on threats to various types of individual and group identity, what lead people to change their identification and become more nationalistic or at least receptive to populist rhetoric. But that's a long and complicated story. So to answer Steve's point, yeah, I think one specific example is in a model we have where what happens when inequality increases is that the economic relative deprivation of people with relatively low incomes increases, okay, because the sort of sum of the weight of incomes higher than their own is getting larger. This means that they get less utility from their own individual economic identity. It's then rational for them to associate themselves relatively more strongly with a national level identity. They then start to care less, the evidence suggests, about inequality and redistribution and things like that. It's as if, well, I was unhappy when I was thinking of myself as an individual economic actor because I wasn't doing very well, but now I can think of myself as English, okay, then that's great because England's great, right? And so the politicians have an incentive to explain how great England is and wave the flag and all that kind of stuff, because then the people who are suffering economic relative deprivation because of the inequality actually come to care less about their economic identity because they're identifying at a more national level instead. So I think, to get back to Steve's question, that would be an example of where, if one has the right model of how individuals are responding to socio-economic circumstances at a kind of higher level of description, then perhaps we can understand how that individuals' attitudes and senses of identity are going to change, which could in turn help understand why they might start to complain less about legal norm violations,
Right.
and things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. And before I forget, related to this somewhat, there is a model by Glaser et al. About why politicians are incentivized to become more extreme in a situation in which the information landscape is fragmented. And the reason is that they gather more votes on the extremes than they lose in the center if they can selectively address their partisan audiences. And I think that's another one of these elite, like how do elites respond to circumstances? And I think that is another example of and that model I thought was pretty good, and they have pretty good validation studies in their paper. And I wonder if we can derive some sort of, intervention from that, which is to say, well, we have to do away with this fractionation into echo chambers because it has all these flow-on consequences that are negative to democracy. But that was just mainly a random thought, but you do want to look at that model.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of the next stage, basically, to come up with a more refined version of the interventions. So once we have comprehensively written down and pinned down as well all the concepts, like in the factors kind of section, we will move on to like the interventions part, and that is certainly something that is demands further research, and it's also a bit difficult because there's just so much to do, and we need to focus on a couple of things we deem most important. And that is also where then the mere misses come back in and say, okay, well, of course, elite norm violations, that is something we have absolutely to look into. But then again, also information system, certainly something today that is much more relevant than it was in some of the earlier near misses cases. So we also have to adopt it a bit to the current kind of system.
Yeah, and this whole interplay, I agree with that. This whole interplay between elites and the public, I think there is quite a bit of stuff. For example, there's work by Rob Brully. I don't know if you've come across that on climate change, where he shows that the reason partisans in the United States are polarized along climate change, along party lines on climate change, is the result of elite cues, not media coverage and media coverage only indirectly because the elites are setting the agenda. And that's definitely worth looking at because, again, it shows how important the role of elites is in shaping public opinion, and in this case, causing toxic polarization, because there was a time not that long ago when there was a weak but nonetheless functioning bipartisan consensus in Washington about climate change. I mean, it wasn't very strong, and the large segments of the Republican Party always opposed climate change, because they were representing the fossil fuel industry. But it wasn't nearly as toxic as it is now, and the key event was elites withdrawing from that. Then there's all the opinion poll data on Republicans and their favorability ratings for Putin going up the moment Trump was elected. I think that's something maybe you want to focus on and explore. And then the crucial thing is, what's the reverse path? Do we have any way of affecting the elites? And that I know less of, with the exception of that Nyhan and Reifler paper. See who cited that, and somebody else may have built on that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's certainly something we will look into. Thanks a lot.
Because, I mean, one focus you could give the paper is elite norm violations. I worry about it becoming so big that you have to write a book, and we don't want to do that. We want to write a paper. And perhaps one way of focusing the paper is to talk only about elite norm violations, because they show up in all the precedents, right?
Yeah.
And then you can still use the model and all that stuff. And you can still maybe talk about your V-Dem characterization of how the stuff goes bad on these different dimensions. But maybe in each instance, you should only view it through the lens of elite norm violations, to simplify.
Yeah,
I think,
at least. Oh, sorry.
Well, I think you can probably do that. You can probably, I mean, if that's a common factor in all the near misses, I can guarantee you that that whole list of things you had about participation, deliberation, all of that, whatever is happening there, I bet you can look at this through the lens of elite norm violations and show, aha, this is how it makes that difference.
Yeah.
And then
I think
you
that's most
conclude,
crucial.
What's that?
I think that's like as you said, the one like common thing in all these cases. And at some point, some elites decided to don't care anymore and like infringe even further.
Indeed, because I mean, of course, that sends a signal. So if we can document that in the literature, and then, I mean, even that by itself is, a paper right there. How elite norm violations are the key to understanding democratic backsliding. I mean, even that would make a contribution.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Anyone? Suggestions or input? Gordon, yeah.
Yeah, just as a very general sort of thought, which is more stuff that we're struggling with ourselves up here, I guess, which is related to this rather general question of where psychology and behavioral science can, have the most useful input, which I think we're all interested in our different ways. So our thought here is much more that we need to understand the individual psychology of people's sense of self-worth and identity and stuff like that. So if I was looking for behavioral science type interventions, I'd be thinking, how can we make people feel that they have alternative sense of identities, perhaps strengthen their identities relating to their local communities, and then they won't have to have resort to all these other kinds of identities that leads to all the problems. So in our view up here, that's where most of the space of possibility is for intervening, and I certainly don't know exactly how, but I'm sort of sensing an interesting contrast coming into view, which we might think about exploring in the future, which is, should you try and make people as individuals somehow smarter, okay, which is the sort of thing that Ralph Hertwig and Steve and colleagues like to do, or is that not in fact the right way? And should we be making people feel safer, because it's when they feel their identities are under threat that all sorts of terrible things happen. So, and there may be something to play between these two different sorts of strategies that behavioral science might take. So that's just a general sort of kind of thing we're thinking about here at the moment, rather than being particularly relevant to your own approach, I guess. But I think it is relevant. I mean, we would say that people will accept elite on violations if the elites are in return offering them some kind of identity related sense of self-worth that makes them feel more safe and less threatened. Okay, so that would be the potential reason for why violations that previously wouldn't have been acceptable suddenly are, at least by a substantial proportion of the population, acceptable. It's a sense that, well, they're doing these wrong things, but they're on our side. They're standing up for the group, the nation that I'm in. Okay, and if that's become increasingly important to you because of economic relative deprivation and things like that, then you're prepared to put up with quite a lot in order to feel that your group is under protection.
Thanks. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Though it does kind of feed into this vicious cycle. I mean, talking about this, that no violation is like maybe driven by polarization, right? And I think that one of the things that we can take from your things, Gordon, is that basically in a less polarized society, there's more room to develop identities that are not just politically driven, but because we are in this polarized ecosystem, there is really no room for nuance. So on the one hand, it also drives this democratic backsliding, and if we want to and if we want to stop this and maybe help people to strengthen other identities that are not polarized, we need to think how we can also like how do we find the balance there? Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Thank you.
informative. So we'll talk again soon, but thanks for doing that.
Thank you for a great feedback. That's really excellent. That's a lot of food for thought and further research.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have about 3 minutes until we start with the professional development session. So yeah, I guess this is where we say bye to Gordon.
Yeah.
And
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.